In this video, we're going to take a closer look at the console view, look at the basic mixing controls, learn about routing, the differences between a send and an output bus, and the different methods of using effects, inserting them into a track's effects bin or using them on an effects bus. First, let's do a little setup. In this demo project, I have a couple of tracks and both are assigned to output to the master bus. I'm going to concentrate on the console view, which is open from the menu or by pressing Alt+2. I'm going to change the icons on the tracks to give a visual indication of their type. To do this, right-click on the icon and navigate to the required one. Next, I'm going to insert a new bus to use as a reverb bus. Right-click in the bus strip of the console view and select Insert Stereo Bus. If the bus strip isn't showing, select it from the Strips menu. Double-click in the name field to rename it. To insert an effects VST into the effects bin, either right-click over the bin and select Audio Effects, navigate through the submenus to the required VST, or use the Effects tab of the browser and drag the VST into the bin. We'll finish setup of this effects bus by increasing the mix control on the reverb to 100%. This means that there is no dry or unaffected sound coming from the processor at all. It is all affected reverb sound, or 100% wet. We'll take a look at why we do this shortly when we look at the routing in detail. The output of the reverb bus I'll change to the master bus. This means that any sound coming from this bus is ultimately going to go through the master bus. Next, we'll turn our attention to the tracks. I'm going to use quick grouping to insert a send to the reverb bus on both tracks at once. Quick grouping is a convenient, quick way of changing the same setting or parameter on multiple tracks at once. The basic principle is the same regardless of parameter or setting. First, select all the tracks or buses that you want to change the parameter on, and then hold down the Control key while you move the parameter control or perform the action. Here, you'll see both volume faders move as I move one. It works with all controls, mute, solo, pan, any control common to all tracks. In this case, we're going to use it to insert a send on both tracks. Click on the Add Send icon and select Reverb from the menu. That's most of the routing setup for this basic project. Routing is a term used to cover the audio signal flow and the route it takes as it's processed. In an analog studio, this would be the signal chain from the tape machine through the mixing console and the cables required to hook in processors and effects. In the digital world, this is all much easier to manage and set up as we've just seen. Now let's take a closer look at what we have done and why. Both piano and vocal output to the master bus. Their signal goes there unaffected by any effects at this stage. We'll do some processing on the tracks later. It's worth mentioning here that there's a subtle difference between a processor and an effect. A processor usually has no dry part to the signal and is located on the track itself. An EQ or compressor, for example. An effect, such as a delay, reverb or chorus, usually has a dry element to it and would sound strange without the dry signal. As a general rule of thumb, they're better used with a send bus for reasons I'll explain shortly. If I turn off the sends and play this part back, you'll hear just the dry signal. Now let's look at the sends. I've just said that effects generally have a dry element to the signal, so you may be wondering why I've set the reverb output to fully wet. The answer is because it's on a send bus and the dry element to the signal is supplied by the track itself going to the master bus, which we've just heard. The amount of wet signal is supplied by the level set in the reverb bus send. I'll turn the reverb sends on and play this back again. Now you can hear that there's far too much reverb. That's because the level of both dry and wet is equal. I'll reduce the reverb send level on both tracks and you'll hear that the result is much more pleasing.
I think about no one else, and I can't be myself.
So let's recap a little here. We have the dry signal still going to the master bus as before, but this time a copy of that signal is sent to the reverb bus where the reverb is applied to it. We control how much reverb there is using the sends level. You might be wondering why not just reduce the reverb bus volume rather than the track send levels. The answer is we could, but then we wouldn't be able to set different levels of reverb for different tracks. That fact leads us on to why an effect is more usually based on a send bus rather than inserted on the track. I could have just inserted a reverb on each track, but there are a couple of reasons why I didn't. First, 2 instances of an effect uses twice as much processing power, so the computer needs to work harder. That isn't much of a problem with just 2 tracks, but it will add up if you have, say, 16 tracks with 16 reverbs and several other effects on each track as well. As well as that, each reverb needs to be set up individually rather than adjusting just one unit. In addition, reverb is usually applied as a simulation of a room or hall, and it can sound odd if different reverbs are used on different instruments in the same mix. Much easier to set up 1 or 2 reverbs and then use the sends to control how much is applied to each track. Now let's look at the difference between an output bus, such as the master bus, and a send bus, such as the reverb. For the actual bus, there is no difference as such. They look the same, have the same controls. The difference comes in the way it is used and the signal is routed to it. I'll turn off both reverb sends on the tracks and change their outputs to the reverb bus. You'll notice that I'm using quick grouping to do that. Now when I start playback, you'll hear the result. All the audio from both tracks is going to the reverb bus where full reverb is applied and then sent to the master bus. There is now no dry signal at all, and the only way of adding any is to start adjusting the mix control on the reverb, but of course we lose the ability to have different levels of reverb on each track again.